Now, someone in particular today is Mr. Aubrey Gurden, who founded the firm of Oliver and Gurden in 1919. Oliver and Gurden are the wholesale cake manufacturers. When did you first decide to enter this profession?
I think actually during the First World War. At that time I was at Keble College. Having been rejected from the army, I carried on through Keble College in the kitchen from end of 1914 up till 1918. At that time I was the only professional man in the kitchen, and we were making a certain amount of cakes for the barnroom. Incidentally, I might mention here that during that period we were catering for two companies, somewhere in the neighbourhood of about 350 officer cadets. During this, the period I was there, Mr. John Chalton, who made a practice of calling in most mornings in the week, came into the kitchen and watched me producing cakes. And here, if I may go back a little, during my very early days, when I was seeking employment, I had made an application at Radley College for a position of second cook. And I lost the job because at that time, I knew nothing about cake making. Returning again to making cakes at Keble College, Mr. Chalton suggested that I should make some to sell in his shop, because he said he could sell every cake I could make. This went on for some time until I really thought he meant it, and having made up my mind that at the end of the war I would go into business on my own, put it to him that should I start on my own, would he carry out his suggestion and take what cakes I could make. He agreed. So I went ahead then, arranged to have property converted at Headington. Well, as time went on, and the war ended, and Mr. Oliver was due to return to take his rightful place in the kitchen, I had made up my mind definitely to go into business on my own. I had purchased property in Headington with the idea of turning it into business premises. And when Mr. Oliver did eventually return, I explained what my position was, that I would not be carrying on in the kitchen, as having been in charge for during the whole of the war. I felt that I could not work under anyone else again, which he quite understood. But at the same time, did make a suggestion that he might himself consider coming in with me. We further discussed going into business together, and one Sunday morning he turned up at my home at Headington, which was in the Windmill Road at that time, and asked me if I'd come to Summertown with him to see some derelict premises which had been used for bakery purposes but had not been occupied for some 15 years. We cycled down together. At that time we weren't in a position to run motor cars or motorcycles, and we eventually arrived at this place, and on the double doors it said Summertown Steam Bakery. The front of the old premises would not have been more than 30 feet, possibly 10 to 12 feet for the entrance into the yard, and the other part was for the shop, which had one up and behind it. The old place was littered up with scaffold poles, old boards, part of the masonry from the old Maglan Bridge, dough bins which had been infested with mite, which were no longer there, and generally speaking the place was very untidy. The proprietor of this place was Mr. John Wibbling, the proprietor of the Oxford Sausages, who was then in advancing years, and we approached him about taking over the premises, but could not get a yes or a no from him. So after several tries, we decided to take possession, and we threw all the rubbish out into the yard, out into the field at the back, which we had entry to, and our first knowledge that we had been accepted as tenants was when he and his gardener started taking all the old scaffolding and etc. away and putting it in some old derelict cottages which were connected.
So that was your first takeover?
That was our first takeover, yeah.
What are your earliest memories during your apprenticeship?
Well, of course, my earliest memories is my first day in the kitchen. When I got into my whites, I was somewhere at the age of 15, I suppose, at the time, between 15 and 16. I were indentured for 4 years, and my father paid £40, which was at that time considerable amount of money, to the chef, to the Mr. Newman, who was chef mancipal at Exeter College, and he paid me the princely sum of 2 and 6pence per week, and that was all I had coming in until I reached the age of 19, except at the times when I went on to work at hotels, which took place during the long vacation. In the kitchen itself, we had then what would be seldom seen today, I suppose, and that is a spit fire on which the legs of lamb or mutton or large pieces of beef or pheasants, any birds, were cooked. This was propelled by a fan in the chimney. They were continually basted with a long-handled ladle from fat which was added to them or had actually dripped from the birds or the beasts itself.
Were your working hours long?
Working hours were, no, not exceptionally long. I worked much longer at a later period, but at that time we started at 7:30 in the morning. We had a break from directly after lunch, about 2 till 5. Then we worked on until after dinner at night. But it was 7 days a week in the terms. Of course, that didn't apply in the vacations, because the vacations were what we made them ourselves. And when I say what we made them, it all depended upon what sort of work we did. But most of the junior servants at that time went away to hotels. And I went into Scotland, Aberystwyth, Scarborough, Devonshire, etc., and so on. You see, during the period I've travelled north, south, east, and west cooking. Later on, I went into camp work, but that did not apply during the period of my apprenticeship.
Did the college staff feel part of the college life itself in those days?
The college staff, perhaps not so much. I mean, we had a different type of undergraduate at the college. We had much more moneyed men at the college then than what we do now. And the scouts themselves, or the scouts were the people who actually looked after the undergraduates on their staircases. They would come to the kitchen and call up the mills for their undergraduates in the morning, booking one for themselves at the same time, which was quite understood by the undergraduates. And when the undergraduates actually left the college, the servants took over, all the furniture was left by the student and sold it to the next student coming in.
Yes.
Because we in the kitchen were really in a different, without being snobby, say a different class to what the others were. We were the only people that really were trained to our job. And it was one of the outstanding things which I would like to mention was the way Sunday was carried out. On Sunday morning we would go in at the usual time at 7:30, but at 9 o'clock, directly after breakfast or shortly after 9 o'clock, we left the kitchen, all of us left the kitchen, went to our respective homes, got into our dark suits, bowler hats and walking stick, and returned to the college about 12 o'clock. We had the opportunity to go into chapel if we wished, but we very seldom took it up. The chef himself always did. But the chef, that was Mr. Newman, used to use a frock-tailed coat and a silk hat to go to church with. And this applied generally throughout Oxford at that time by the chefs in Oxford. And a matter of fact, one chef at Oxford used to drive to college in his carriage and pair.
Stately days indeed.
Yeah. Of course, Oxford too at that time was a different place altogether than what it is today. There was periods when I suppose one could have used a shotgun in High Street without any fear of hitting anyone. And of course, motor cars were almost unknown at that time. Matter of fact, the first motor car I ever saw was coming over Malden Bridge with a man carrying a red flag in front of it. That was my earliest recollection of motor cars in Oxford. I did drive one at my first visit to Scotland, but that was only in a private estate, and that wasn't for many, only a matter of a quarter mile or half a mile or so, and that was the 1012 Argyle. With, at that time, all the controls were on the steering column, and also the hour was by drip feed.
I haven't asked you yet, where were you born?
Well, I was born at Old Marston, which is, I suppose, some 2 to 3 miles from the centre of the city, and which was much farther to us as children than it would be today. I'm not thinking actually in mileage, but in the isolation, because we were definitely isolated from Oxford at that time, because there was, where it's a built-up area now, there was just a narrow road to it, unlit road. Whereas at that time we in Marston, we had no amenities at all. There was no such thing as water. You had to get that from a pump there or a well. There was no electric light. There was no main drainage. There was no gas. So we used either our lamps or candles for lighting purposes, but in most cases I suppose most people went to bed when it got dark. But my earliest recollection there is the Diamond Jubilee, Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee, which took place, I think I'm correct in saying, 1897. And why it stands out in my memory is because as a child I was surprised to see barrels of beer with the taps turned on and the beer continuously running through the buckets, and men walking along dipping their cans or cups in whatever they had and simply drinking it. That is one of my very earliest recollections. But you may ask where I went to school. Well, I went to school, the village school, until I was 7. From there I went to Oxford. And you may ask how we got into Oxford. Well, at that time, there was only one way of getting into Oxford, and that was by walking, unless by some chance a milk float was going in. When I say a milk float, a float that was delivering milk to perhaps college, a college or something of that sort. I went to various schools in Oxford. At that time it was easy. One could walk straight out of one school to another, and when one was asked what was wanted by the headmaster, you'd say, I'd come to school. He said, where'd you come from? I came from Marston. What class were you in? And you simply went and sat in the class. I mean, your name being taken down in the register, you simply went and sat in the class. If you wanted to move to another school, well, you did the same thing. Well, this happened with me. I went to several schools until I eventually finished up at St. Peter's in the East, which was in Rose Lane, a school that is not there any longer now. It was just a small school with about 40 boys and 40 girls under one roof, but separated by doors, by sliding doors. We had one headmaster and one headmistress.
Was discipline enforced?
Yes, discipline was enforced, and the schoolmaster, which name was Boucham, was one that was always talking to us. I suppose his reasons were very good. He used to speak of the boys who had left the school and had made good and held them up an example to us. And he was a man who dressed as a naval man. He had a naval type hat and a naval type of beard. But he also, in addition to teaching at the school, he also helped backward students in there during his spare time.
Are there any family links with your firm still?
Yes, my son is with the firm. When I retired, which was in 1960, my son still carried on with the firm of Oliver and Gurden, who are really a part of the Lions organisation now.
Do any other members of your original staff still work with the firm?
It has bowed down now to, I think there are only some, actually, as I can think, I've severed, more or less severed connection with it. There is only about one man, I believe, still there, who came to us as a lad from school. His name is Keble, George Keble. We have had quite a few who came to us in the very early days. One of the first was Mr. Judge, Mr. Harrison, Mr. Porter, and so on. But this was some, probably within the first 12 months of we being in business. But in most cases, those have retired now, having reached retirement age at 65.
Now, how do you build up a firm? How did you plan and develop it?
Well, as I mentioned, I think, earlier, we started under very difficult conditions there. We had water, but no gas, no electricity. Toilets were there, it is true. And the first lot of cakes I made, when I put them into the oven, I burnt them rather badly. They weren't unsaleable, because at that time I think almost anything would have sold. But I burnt them, but it was not so much my fault as the fact that the thermometer, which had been in operation for some 15 years, was faulty. Of course, after that I used my own judgment and got away very, very well. At that time, cakes, I had to use my hands. I did the bulk of the manufacture. I had to use my hands for making the cakes, which applied to whipping up the sponges by hand, which was a hand whisk, eventually replaced by a Marston mechanical whisk. And I wore my nails right down till they were almost unbearable and got so sore. After a time, we had electricity and gas put in. Got electricity and gas put in. And from then on, I suppose we didn't look back. We put in a shaft, a motor-driven shaft, where we could drive several machines off, and we eventually put in cheap powered machines, gradually increasing to up to better standard. But going back to lighting, in the earliest days we used candles to keep us going. And on one instance we ran out of candles, so my partner, Oliver, went along to the public house, Rose and Crown, which the factory eventually took over and built over, and borrowed an oil lamp. He had no sooner got along with it, but the landlord's wife came and fetched it away again. On that particular night we worked until we ran out of tapers, which was our only means of lighting. We did many nights' work. For many nights we worked all night, and as a matter of fact, it was difficult. There was times when my family hardly saw me during the week. When I came home very sad. I'd sleep there if I slept at all. And for several days and nights we worked straight the way through.
Which of your products gave you personally the most pleasure?
Well, I suppose the old Oxford ice cake, which was one of the first things we produced. The first things we produced was Oxford ice cakes, ice sandwiches, and small fruit and Madeira cakes. I said the Oxford ice cake was the nicest one because it was produced with a very light sponge. The eggs and sugar being beaten together and melted butter poured into it, and then the flour blended into it, and it produced a very nice cake, which was very much appreciated.
You retired in 1960. How have you enjoyed your freedom from business worries?
In mentioning this, I suppose I should also mention that I married in 1913, a Miss Westall. I have 4 children, 3 girls and 1 boy, all happily married, I'm pleased to say. I mention this because my happiness and my retirement has been tied up quite a lot with my family. We've travelled, my wife and I, and one of the daughters. Most of the time was spent on the sea, and very enjoyable it has been. We've been travelled most of the seas, been through the Suez Canal several times, been through the Panama Canal several times, been to Hawaii, Acapulco, San Francisco, and so on.